Hi, welcome again to our Bible study we've entitled, Who is Jesus of Nazareth? Really the most important question you'll ever answer in your life because your eternity hinges on it. As always, I hope that you download the latest study guide. And this time we're going to talk about something that I often get asked by people who didn't grow up in a church home or who right now are far from the gospel, have really no understanding of biblical history or what the Bible teaches, and they ask some really great questions, and here's one of them, and that is there any evidence for Jesus actually existing outside the Bible, or what's sometimes called extra-biblical literature? And I'm here to tell you, yeah. There are many instances, many evidences of Jesus walking on this earth, and let's take a look at some of those. I'm going to share this with you. I printed that before you, just so you can maybe cut and paste and share it with others as well. And then we're going to talk about what each evidence tells us just about Jesus from people who didn't believe in him, in many cases were critical and hostile toward Jesus and his followers. So let's start at that. Did Jesus live and minister, it says, died and rise from the grave as the gospel records, or is it an elaborate conspiracy? The ancient evidence related to Jesus reveals that there were eyewitnesses and he did exist in history. Now, is there any evidence of that outside the Bible? Well, yes, there is. So let's take a look at some of this. Let's first of all look at the hostile, non-biblical pagan accounts. There are a number of them that point out that, the very miraculous nature of Jesus and the events surrounding his life. So let's take a look at some of these. As you see on your study guide, there's a guy named Thallus, lives around 52 AD. Thallus is perhaps the earliest secular writer to mention Jesus, and he is so ancient in his writings that they don't exist anymore. A lot of them don't. But Julius Africanus, writing around 221 AD, does quote Thallus, who previously tried to explain away the darkness occurring after Jesus' crucifixion. Here's what he wrote. He said, "On the whole world there pressed a most dreadful darkness. The rocks were rent by an earthquake," this is the time of Jesus' death, "and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness, Thallus, in his third book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun." So what do we learn from Thallus's quotation that Africanus gives him? Well, we learn that Jesus lived, that he was crucified, that there was an earthquake and darkness at the point of his crucifixion. Again, this is from someone who didn't believe in Jesus, but clearly knew and recorded the events that occurred at that time. Then there's a guy named Tacitus. He lives roughly 56 to 120 AD. He's known for his analysis and examination of historical documents and is among the most trusted of the ancient historians. He was a senator under Emperor Vespasian and was also proconsul of Asia. In his annals of around 116 AD, he describes Emperor Nero's response to the Great Fire in Rome and Nero's claim that the Christians were to blame. You've probably heard about this before, but here's the quote. "Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite, tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, Jesus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty under the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of the procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and became popular." So he's talking about how Christianity even broke out, all about this Jesus, this Christus. Now, what do we learn from that account of Tacitus? Well, he confirms some historical things in the biblical narrative, that Jesus lived in Judea, that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate, and that his followers were persecuted for their faith in Jesus. So you know that from someone, again, who didn't believe in Jesus. Now we move on to a man named Mara bar Serpion. Sometime around 70 AD, the Syrian philosopher named Mara bar Serpion or Serapion, some would say, is writing to encourage his son, compared the life and persecution of Jesus with that of other philosophers who were persecuted for their ideas. The fact that Jesus is known to be a real person with this kind of influence is important. This Mara really refers to him as a wise king. Notice what he says. What benefit did the Athenians obtain by putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as judgment for their crime. Or the people of Samos for burning the Pythagoras. In one moment, their country was covered with sand. Or the Jews by murdering their wise king. This is a reference to Jesus. After that, their kingdom was abolished. God rightly avenged these men. The wise king lived on in the teachings he enacted. Now, what can we understand about Jesus from his account? Well, Jesus was wise, an influential man who died for his beliefs. The Jewish leadership was somehow responsible for Jesus' death. Jesus' followers adopted the beliefs and lived their lives accordingly. You have a guy named Pliny the Younger who lives from roughly 61 to 113 AD. The early Christians were also described in the early non-Christian history of this man. In his letter to the Roman Emperor Trajan, this is how he describes the lifestyles of the early Christians. They, the Christians, were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves together by a solemn oath, not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. After which it was the custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. So what do you learn from the Christians from Pliny the Younger? Well, you learn that the Christians believed that Jesus was God. The first Christians upheld a high moral code, and these early followers met regularly to worship Jesus. Then you got another guy, and I could give you many more, but I'll just give you one more in this grouping, Centonius. He's a Roman historian, lives roughly between 69 and 140 AD, and he lived underneath the house of the Emperor Hadrian, and he writes to Christians about Christians in their description of their treatment underneath Emperor Claudius, who was from 41 to 54 AD. Now listen to this. He says, because the Jews at Rome caused constant disturbances at the instigation of Christ, he, Claudius, expelled them, the Christians, from Rome, or the Jews perhaps as well. This expulsion took place in 40 AD, and in another work, Centonius wrote about the fire which destroyed Rome in 64 AD, under the reign of Nero. Nero, again, we talked about this before in a previous quote, blamed the Christians for the fire and then punished them severely as a result. Here's what Centonius wrote. Nero inflicted punishment on the Christians, a sect given to a new and mischievous religious belief. Now, so what did we learn from just those two from Centonius? We learned that they were committed to their belief that Jesus was God and withstood torture and punishment of the Roman Empire. Jesus had a curious and immediate impact on his followers, empowering them even to die courageously for what they believed to be true. So when you have someone tell you, well, there's no historical evidence that Jesus ever lived, you need to share this information. Those are people that need to do a little better research, or they just are speaking like that because they have an axe to grind. They don't want Jesus to be God, because that means they'd have to listen to his word and maybe change the way they live or make some different choices. But there's also hostile, non-biblical Jewish accounts. Probably the one that's most known is Josephus. And so let's take a look at what Josephus, he lives between 37 and 101 AD. In more detail than any other non-biblical historian, Josephus writes about Jesus in his writing, The Antiquities of the Jews. It's around 93 AD. Now you need to understand that Josephus was pretty well known. He mentions the execution of James. He describes the death of John the Baptist. James was described as the brother of Jesus the Christ. He talks about Jesus being a wise man and the Messiah. Now, there's some legitimate controversy about some of the things that were added by Christians to later copies of Josephus' work. But let's just take the most, I would say, conservative belief of what actually Josephus wrote before maybe Christians down the road added some other things that were probably true, but Josephus didn't write in the beginning. Here's what Josephus wrote that's the most conservative and will tell us, again, he believed Jesus existed as well. Now around the time lived Jesus, a wise man. For he was a worker of amazing deeds, we call them miracles, and was a teacher of the people who gladly accepted the truth. He won over both many Jews and many Greeks. Pilate, when he heard him accused by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross. But those who had first loved him did not cease doing so, in other words, following him or loving him. To this day, the tribe of Christians named after him has not disappeared. Now, what can we get from Josephus, just that section? Jesus lived in Palestine. He was a wise man and a teacher, worked amazing miracles or amazing deeds. He was accused by the Jews, crucified under Pontius Pilate, and had followers called Christians. So history shows us that, yes, Jesus indeed lived and walked on this earth. And as we've talked in previous Bible classes, the eyewitness accounts, we call them the Gospels, are really better attested to than any ancient writing, period. People who don't like to believe that the gospel accounts are the eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life and ministry aren't taking this very same criteria that they use for other books of antiquity and applying them to the gospels. They're often not doing that because, again, they have a bias against the supernatural, bias against Jesus being the Messiah. As people have often said, all theology is Christology. That is to say that the heart of the Christian religion is Jesus Christ. And that's why we spent so much time in this study taking a look and seeing who Jesus really is and answering the question, who is Jesus of Nazareth? All modern religious heresies today are actually resurrected heresies, which in some manner adulterate the person or the work of Jesus Christ. They either won't let Jesus be true God, or they won't let him be true man, or they won't let him be both, because he needs to be 100% each to be our Savior. Let me just finish with two quotes from Martin Luther about this subject. He says this: "All error, heresy, idolatry, offense, misuse, and evil in the church originally came from despising or losing sight of this article of faith in Jesus Christ, namely, that Jesus is the Son of God. And if one looks at it correctly and clearly, all heresies do contend against this dear article of Jesus Christ." Again, Luther said this: "The devil attacks Christ in three lines of battle. One, he will not let him, Jesus, be God. Another, will not let him be man. And the third, will not let him do what he has done. Each of the three wants to reduce Christ to nothing." So who is Jesus of Nazareth? He is the God-man, 100% God, 100% man. Needed to be so that his life could be lived perfectly in our place, in your place, and so that his death on the cross would make payment for your sins and my sins and the sin of the whole world, so that he could be our perfect prophet, priest, and king who has conquered our great enemies, sin, death, and Satan. I pray that this study has strengthened your faith in Jesus, or maybe God has used it to begin a relationship with him. God's blessings.